and good evening all. Thank you for joining us tonight as we remain in the modern age and in England to boot, as we talk about the Aston Martin DBR9 GT1, one of the most consistently competitive of the mid-2000s GT cars and, in my opinion, one of the prettiest as well. Aston's entries in sports car racing throughout the latter half of the 20th century were intermittent at best. They achieved some notable successes in the 1950s and early 60s, with their brightest moment coming with the DBR1, particularly in 1959 when the factory team went 1-2 in the 24 Hours of Le Mans that year, and won that year's World Sports Car Championship besides. Other models were not as competitive, and following their rather disastrous attempt to recapture glory at Le Mans and
Cry God for Harry, England and St. George. Let us march to the music of Shawaddy Waddy.
With Lola's T70, they took another 15 years off from sports cars, until they agreed to serve as an engine supplier for Group C constructors Nimrod and Emka, before going all in on a factory effort for the 1989 season, which gave us the AMR1, which wasn't great either, but did at least show some promise, only to have the Ecclestoning occur and scupper plans for an improved AMR2 the following year. Oh, there was also this heavily modified, and privately modified, I might add, version of the DBS as well, which I consistently forget about. It was called the RHAM/1 or RAM/1. It did manage a podium finish in class in GTP at the 77 edition of Le Mans, despite reportedly completing 3/4 of the race with cracked front brake discs. Things may not have been objectively better in the old days, but I would argue that they were inarguably ballsier. Anyway, the end of Aston's Group C ambitions also saw an end to their racing activities again for about 15 years, until they partnered up with the chaps over at ProDrive. ProDrive, if you'll recall, had spent a decent portion of the early 2000s racing Ferrari 550s, badged as Ferrari 550 GTSs, and these also were modified from off-the-shelf street cars in a semi-privateer program. They achieved great success, despite no support from Maranello, and battled hard with the Corvette team at Le Mans and in the US. They also managed victory at Le Mans in 2003 in class. 2005, however, marked the end of their work on the 550 project, and ProDrive's focus pivoted to their new relationship with Aston and on converting the recently launched DB9 road car into a proper racer. In contrast to the 550 project, however, this was a true joint venture between the two partners, and it was a pleasantly short drive from the Aston factory in Gaydon to ProDrive's factory, less than 15 miles, which that'll save on travel expenses compared to Maranello, which was over 1,000 miles by car from ProDrive for anyone keeping score at home, and you could still be home in time for tea. Since the 90s era of GT1 was now long gone, and prototypes were called prototypes again, the GT1 rules at the time did mandate that entrants had to be based on proper road-going vehicles. There was no chicanery with luggage space in the fuel tank or squirreled away inaccessibly in the monocoque. Looking at you, Toyota and Mercedes. And thus, for the new DBR9, the general essence of the bodywork, designed by Henrik Fisker and Ian Callum, was retained, as was the bonded aluminium chassis, the latter almost unmodified apart from a few minor homologation concessions, while all non-structural body panels were carbon fiber instead of the road car's aluminium to save weight. One of the noteworthy peculiarities of the bonded chassis was that a roll cage couldn't be welded in place, as with the 550 or other conventional steel monocoques, and so it had to be built into the chassis before the chassis was fully assembled. This did, however, serve to save weight and improve stiffness, so they had that going for them, which is nice. The block and heads for the 6-liter naturally aspirated V12 were similarly carried over from the road car, with uprated twin overhead cams, crankshafts, bearings, and dry sump lubrication to maintain high reliability at competition loads, and to bump power output from the road car's 450 horsepower and 420 pound-feet of torque to more than 750 horsepower and 649 torques. Although class-mandated air restrictors then throttled the DBR9 back to a arguably more reasonable 625 horsepower and 550 torques for competition use. Power went to the rear wheels through an X-Track 6-speed sequential manual transaxle, replacing the ZF selectable automatic in the road car. Actually, there was a stick shift available as well in the early days for the DB9 road car, but I don't think it sold very well, which is a shame. And the typical race car weight loss program meant that the 3,770 pounds of luxurious Grand Tourer melted away to become a 2,425-pound speed machine, which improved performance such that a journey to 60 miles an hour that once took 4.9 seconds now took only 3.4, and 100 would arrive a mere 3 seconds after that, continuing on to a top speed of, well, reports are a bit mixed, but generally given as about 205 miles an hour, or 330 kph. Suspension was double wishbones with adjustable Koni dampers and Eibach springs on all 4 wheels. Brakes were carbon units from Brembo with 6-piston monoblock calipers. Wheels were sourced from Oz Racing, and tires were, of course, from Michelin. All of the design and engineering work for building the race car was significantly informed by ProDrive's prior experience with the 550s, with Aston Martin Racing and ProDrive's George Howard Chappell, admitting that while the DBR9 wasn't an evolution of the Ferrari, in fact they shared less than 20 components in common, they certainly took a number of the learnings and improved upon them, including carrying over development of the Ferrari's X-Track gearbox, and a general set of design principles that, given the significant increases in funds from what was essentially a rather ambitious privateer program, meant that they were able to leverage technologies like computational fluid dynamics and CAD software to precisely engineer every panel and bit of the bodywork, while the Ferrari was reportedly done with a couple of wind tunnel sessions and the more traditional foam, bondo, and wet laying of molds to create body panels. The advantage of the latter is, of course, a much quicker design process, but the newer approach greatly facilitated Aston Martin's primary goal with the program, which was the building and sale of the DBR9 as a production race car, or near as one can get, with 32 cars planned for a several-year-long production run, 12 for the factory or factory-affiliated race teams, and 24 private customers. This was borne out by several aspects of the customer sales agreement, in addition to the engineering emphasis on reliability for privateers of varying means, which guaranteed the engines for 5,000 kilometers between overhauls and essentially required them to be returned to Aston for rebuilding at each prescribed interval. That isn't to say, however, that things were cheap. The price of entry, never mind a full season's campaign in the ALMS or LMS with the possibility of a very expensive and very desirable success penalty add-on in the form of a Le Mans spot, was a not insignificant $900,000 or 475,000 British pounds. This was still a good bit cheaper than purchasing an LMP1 or a GT1 from the 90s, once you adjust for inflation, and probably even when you don't have to, but it's more than I've got sitting in the bank, I'm sad to say. Okay. Ready for the start of the 2005 season, the factory Aston team competed in parts of the ALMS and at Le Mans, leaving the Le Mans series to the first customer to get their hands on the car, that of the Converse team and Surtec Motorsport. In its first outing at that year's 2005 12 Hours of Sebring, the car put in an incredible performance for a debutante, winning in class and besting the heavy favorites of the very experienced Corvette racing team by more than a lap. In fact, coming in only 3 laps off the outright podium and setting high expectations for Le Mans that year. Things looked promising there as well, with the number 58 and 59 factory cars qualifying 1-2 in GT1 and not far behind some of the slower LMP1s. They were about mid-pack with the LMP2s and more than 3 seconds ahead of the best of the C6Rs. But Le Mans has rarely favored outright lap pace over durability and experience, and fuel system issues during the race meant that the second-place qualified car of David Brabham, Stéphane Sarrazin, and Darren Turner would finish only third on the podium, 16 laps behind the best of the Corvettes and 14 behind its sister car in second, while the pole-sitter was out after 327 laps, the furthest achieved of the DNFs. The privateers also took a win in the LMS, that wasn't yet the European Le Mans Series, once they actually had their car, winning the GT1 class at the 1,000 kilometers of the Nürburgring in September, following a fourth at the Silverstone round. 2006 brought a full-season ALMS entry for the factory squad, this time seeing their star rise in the mid and late season with victories at Lime Rock Park, Miller Motorsports Park, Meuse Sport, Petit Le Mans, and Laguna Seca to narrowly miss the championship title behind Corvette, who had bested them at Sebring and in the early parts of the season, and this set the tone for several years of battles that essentially picked up where the pro-drive Ferraris had left off, or it would have if Aston could have been bothered. Instead, further seasons in the ALMS for the DBR9 fell to the intermittent participation of customer teams, with no effective challenge for the Corvette squad in the ALMS until GT1 went away in 2009. In the Le Mans Series, things went somewhat better, with L'Arbre Competition finding success with the car and winning the 2006 Teams Championship, and decent results came in subsequent years for both L'Arbre and others. But 2007 was largely dominated by Team Oreca in their Saleen S7R. 2008 saw a continuation of the Corvette Aston battles foretold in 2006 in the ALMS, and in 2009, GT1 was still a thing in the MS, but Corvette battled with Saleen and Lamborghini that year, with two Aston teams putting in only a single appearance each. But, I hear you cry, with wailing eyes and gnashing elbows, about Le Mans. That was where the truly memorable battles between Aston and Corvette took place. Well, it was indeed at Le Mans that, after the moderate disappointment of 2005, the factory squad largely focused their efforts. 2006 again saw the factory cars, now wearing 007 and 009 as a special dispensation from the ACO. This would later become an Aston standard for their works entries, no matter the class. At the time, triple-digit numbers were not allowed. Saw the factory cars qualify at the head of the GT1 field again, with Team BMS Scuderia Italia's entry in fourth, split by the best of the vets, and the race ran close between the 009 car and the vets, with the 007 car serving as the initial bad luck sponge that started with radio issues that led to a broken oil sump that lived in the house that Jack built, and then brought a tire puncture in to sweeten the pot. The 009 car ran an excellent race until late morning when, with almost an entire lap in hand, the car suffered a clutch failure that cost 3/4 of an hour in the garage and dropped it to fourth in class. It would eventually finish fifth behind the Team Modena DBR9 in fourth, with one lap between them. The 007 car recovered from its early malaises to some extent, and excellent nighttime driving meant that they worked their way back up the order to finish second in class, but they were still 5 laps behind the winning number 64 Corvette. 2007 again saw an Aston qualify in the top spot for GT1, but this time it was one of the L'Arbre competition cars, rather than one of the AMR entries, which were mid-pack amongst the GT1 competitors. This is counterbalanced a bit by the fact that L'Arbre's other car was last among the GT1 Aston entries and only just ahead of the Scuderia Ecosse Ferrari GT2, but they weren't the slowest of the GT1s either, at which point it's a bit of a wash. The start of the race was on a damp track, and this caught a number of drivers out, though the biggest sigh of relief from the Aston squad came not from a Corvette crash-out, but rather a prop shaft failure for the number 64 car, after only about an hour and a half of running. This left the faster qualifying of the 2 Corvette racing cars out of the running, although there were 3 more cars to support the remaining number 63 car against no less than 6 DBR9s. The factory Astons built their lead through the nighttime and early morning hours, but rain, it turned out, was the primary factor in the closing hours of the race. While the Corvettes were faster in the wet, they were unable to close the Astons during the frequent safety car deployments, and these interruptions meant that the 63 car was only able to work its way up to second, and the factory 009 car took the checkered flag to grant Aston Martin their first win at La Sarthe since 1959, albeit only in class that year rather than their outright win 48 years prior. 2008 was a closer race, with Corvette Racing taking their first ever Le Mans pole, followed closely by an S7R. I was about to say an SR71, which probably would have beaten a Corvette C6R for pole had it been a drag race. The best of the Astons was further down, something of a come down from prior years, but come race day they seemed to lose their sandbags and put the heat on the vets. To be fair, it's a well-known fact that the Gulf colors take 5% off any racing lap times, so the fact that they were running those that year may have had something to do with it. All four of the factory cars spent much of the early race on the same lap, that is to say the two factory Corvettes and the two factory Astons, with the 009 and the 63 coming down to a showdown in the last hours after the 007 and the 64 cars both developed alternator faults. Morning rain meant that things remained close to the very last minute, and the 009 finished just ahead of the 63 on the same lap, with the 64 2 laps behind and the 007 2 further in arrears. This twice on the trot at La Sarthe gave Aston the confidence and momentum to take their nascent LMP1 program to the next level for 2009, also in hopes of a 50-year anniversary repeat victory of their original 1959 victory, and the factory squad and Gulf livery thus appeared with Lola-chassied LMP1s, sporting retuned versions of the DBR9's V12, leaving GT1 glory and the possibility of a three-peat to Jet Alliance Racing. Going up against four C6Rs, including the requisite factory 63 and 64 cars, it was a long shot at best. While technically, two Aston-engined cars did finish just ahead of the best Corvette with 342 laps completed that year, it was unfortunately the slower of the LMP1 DBR1-2s and the speedy racing B08/60 LMP1, rather than two pro-drive-run GT1s, and the Jet Alliance car finished as the penultimate classified car, almost 50 laps down the racing order. Corvette racing moved down to GT2 the subsequent year, and a single DBR9 was entered from young driver AMR for that year's Le Mans race. Despite qualifying on pole from the class, it fared poorly in race and was 20 laps behind the class-winning Saleen S7R by the end of the 24 hours, although they were also 7 laps behind the best-placed GT2, which isn't exactly how it's supposed to go, but would help explain why GT1 was dropped for the 2011 race, in addition to its waning popularity and greatly increasing costs, this then giving us a rebranding of GT2 to GTE, which is a state of affairs that persisted until last year at time of recording. There was also an entry in the Japanese Super GT Championship in 2009, but the DBR9 didn't make much odds in the Land of the Rising Sun, as it participated in only 3 races and finished 14th of a 15-car field in all of them. 17 total DBR9s were built, far fewer than the planned 32, but some of the chassis originally slotted for the DBR9's construction were reportedly shifted to the DBR9 GT3 production line, which gave rise to a continuing line of Aston GT racing cars that we've enjoyed to this day, when Aston has now had the good grace to also return a V12 to the prototype field this upcoming year with the Valkyrie. For this video's shameless plugs for other content on the channel. If you'd like to know more about the Aston Martin AMR 1 or Group C in general, there are videos dealing specifically with the car and a broader overview of the class and the Ecclestoning that killed it. The ProDrive Ferrari 550s that came before the DBR9 have been covered, as have the C6R GT1s with which they competed. Actually, the C5R GT1s that competed with the Ferraris are covered as well. If you do watch those, they're mostly a bit on the older side, so let me know if you feel they need a re-record and/or expansion. Obviously, the Lola T70, B08/60, and Lola Aston DBR1-2 have all been discussed fairly recently, and if you'd like to know a bit more about the distinctions between the GT classes, or just about the crazy era that was late 90s GT1 and exactly why I'm calling Toyota out for using a fuel tank as luggage space, the DEFCON GT video is for you, in which I explain the modern-ish development of GT classes as they raced in IMSA and the WEC, through the metaphor of the American military's defense condition metric. And I think that about covers it. Go forth and expand your horizons. Well, it's that time again. You've wasted another perfectly good third of an hour listening to Lensler, and for this week's call to action not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube,
like, comment, subscribe.
Don't forget to brine your turkey for Thanksgiving. If you haven't acquired it already, you should go purchase one in the next day or two. Frozen needs to be defrosted and then brined. Fresh should just be put directly in the brine, probably on Monday. Sit for 3 days until Wednesday, then rest in the fridge uncovered overnight until Thursday morning, when it should be roasted, for those of us in the U.S. For our friends in foreign lands, consider this an early reminder for your Christmas bird. Between doing most of the food prep for 7 courses and 24 people for next Thursday, and getting married on Sunday, I may not have time for a video next week, but I'll do my best. And I'll be providing more tips for other festive meats and sides as we continue into the holidays. But in the meantime, feel free to share your favorite suggestions for Thanksgiving dishes below. It's my favorite holiday of the year, and I take it damn seriously. Anyway, that just leaves it for me to say, as always, thank you for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you are watching, and to wish you all good night and a good tomorrow.